I've never told this story publicly before, and even writing it now makes my stomach tighten. For most of my life, people knew me as William Carter. At least, that's the name I used. The truth is that William Carter wasn't the name I was born with. It belonged to someone else long before it belonged to me. Before anyone jumps to conclusions, I wasn't some master criminal or international fugitive. I was just a desperate man who made a decision that slowly turned into the biggest crime of my life. 20 years ago, I was drowning. Dead-end jobs, bad decisions, and a record full of mistakes that followed me everywhere. Every job application ended the same way. Every landlord looked at me like I was trouble before I even opened my mouth. It felt like my past had become a prison sentence with no release date. The idea came to me by accident. I was working temporary construction jobs back then. One afternoon, during a break, I overheard two workers talking about a man named William Carter. He had grown up in another state, had no close family, and had apparently died years earlier in a remote accident. Nobody talked about him much. Nobody seemed to remember him. Most people would have forgotten that conversation. I didn't. For weeks afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about it. A man with no family. No one looking for him. No one checking on him. A life that had simply ended and disappeared from everyone's attention. Meanwhile, I was trapped inside a life I hated. At first it was just a fantasy. A stupid daydream. What would it be like to wake up as someone else? To leave every mistake behind? To walk into a room without people already judging you? But fantasies have a dangerous way of becoming plans when you're desperate enough. The more I thought about William Carter, the more the idea started feeling less like a dream and more like an opportunity. I told myself I wasn't stealing anything. I told myself I was just starting over. That was the first lie. And it was far from the last. After that conversation on the construction site, I became obsessed. It started innocently enough. I'd spend evenings looking through public records, newspaper archives, and anything else I could access. I wanted to know whether William Carter really existed and whether anyone still remembered him. Every new piece of information felt like I was assembling a puzzle. The more I learned, the more dangerous my thinking became. William had died young. There were no children, no spouse, and very few relatives listed anywhere. The trail seemed to end years before I found it. Most people would have seen that as a sad story. I saw something else, an empty identity. Looking back, that's the moment my moral compass began to fail. I wasn't yet planning to impersonate him. At least, that's what I told myself. I convinced myself I was only curious. But curiosity slowly turned into research. Research turned into opportunity. And opportunity turned into temptation. For the first time in years, I felt hopeful. Not because my life was improving, but because I believed I had found a way to escape it entirely. The shift from thinking about it to actually considering it happened so gradually that I barely noticed. For months, I carried the idea around in my head. Whenever something went wrong, a rejected job application, another overdue bill, another reminder that my past followed me everywhere, I found myself thinking about William Carter. His name became a symbol of escape. I began comparing our ages, our backgrounds, even the small details I could find about where he had lived. It felt less like studying a stranger and more like studying a role I might someday play. That's what scared me. I still remember sitting alone in my apartment one night, staring at a stack of unpaid notices spread across my kitchen table. The power company wanted money. My landlord wanted money. Everyone wanted something I couldn't give them. For the first time, I admitted the truth to myself. I wasn't researching anymore. I was imagining a future built on a lie. And once I allowed that possibility into my mind, it became harder and harder to push it back out. Once I crossed that mental line, planning became almost automatic. I started approaching the idea like a project. That sounds cold, but it's the truth. Every evening after work, I'd sit with a notebook and write down questions. What documents would I need? What details about William's life could be verified? What mistakes could expose me? The more questions I answered, the more confident I became. That confidence was dangerous. I learned everything I could about him. Old addresses, schools, places he had worked. I memorized dates until I could recite them without hesitation. I even practiced answering imaginary questions out loud. If someone asked where I grew up, I had an answer. If they asked where I went to school, I had an answer for that too. At the time, I convinced myself that careful preparation somehow made the crime less wrong. It didn't. What it did do was make the fantasy feel real. For the first time, I wasn't just dreaming about becoming someone else. I was actively preparing to leave my own identity behind. Every crime has a moment when it stops being an idea and becomes reality. Mine came on a rainy Tuesday morning. I remember standing outside a government records office, my hands shoved into my jacket pockets. I had barely slept the night before. Part of me hoped something would stop me, a locked door, a missing document, some unexpected obstacle that would force me to abandon the whole thing. Nothing happened. The door opened. People walked in and out. The world carried on as if I were just another person running errands. That ordinary feeling made everything easier. I had spent months preparing, gathering information, and rehearsing details. Now I was taking the first real steps toward claiming a life that wasn't mine. Even then, I knew I could still walk away. Nobody had forced me into that building. But desperation has a way of disguising itself as necessity. As I moved forward, my fears slowly mixed with excitement. I wasn't thinking about the consequences anymore. I was thinking about possibilities. And that mindset became the most dangerous thing of all. The strange thing about assuming another identity wasn't the paperwork or the preparation. It was the first conversation. Until then, everything had felt distant, almost theoretical. But one afternoon, a clerk looked up from her desk, smiled politely, and asked for my name. For a split second I froze. Then I said it. William Carter. The words came out smoother than I expected. Nothing happened. No alarm sounded. No one questioned me. The clerk simply nodded and continued with her work. That ordinary reaction sent a shock through me. I'd spent months imagining discovery, yet the world accepted the lie without hesitation. Walking out afterward, I felt both exhilarated and sick. I kept replaying the moment in my head. Part of me was thrilled that it had worked. Another part knew I'd crossed a boundary I could never uncross. It wasn't just a plan anymore. Someone had addressed me as William. And I'd answered. That night I barely slept. Every sound outside my apartment made me think someone had uncovered the truth. But morning came, and nothing happened. The lie survived its first test. After that first successful step, things began moving faster than I expected. What surprised me most wasn't how difficult it was to act like William. It was how quickly people accepted him. Employers, landlords, acquaintances, none of them saw the history I was trying to escape. They only saw the person standing in front of them. For the first time in years, doors started opening. I found steady work. I rented a decent apartment. Conversations that used to end with suspicion suddenly felt normal. Every small success reinforced the same dangerous belief that I had made the right choice. But maintaining the lie required constant vigilance. I carried details of William's life in my head everywhere I went. Birthplaces, dates, old addresses, family names. If someone asked an unexpected question, I had to answer instantly. Any hesitation could raise suspicion. The pressure was exhausting. Sometimes I would catch my reflection in a store window and feel genuinely confused. Was I still the man I had been born as, or was I becoming the character I'd spent months constructing? That question started haunting me. For nearly a year, everything seemed to work. That was the problem. Success made me careless. When you're constantly afraid of being exposed, caution becomes second nature. But when months pass without consequences, confidence starts replacing fear. I stopped rehearsing every conversation. I stopped double-checking every detail before speaking. Then the cracks appeared. At a company gathering, a coworker casually asked about the town where I supposedly grew up. I'd memorized the basic facts, but he had actually visited the area years earlier. Suddenly he was asking specific questions, street names, local businesses, landmarks. I answered as best I could. He didn't accuse me of anything, but I noticed a brief look of confusion on his face. That tiny moment stayed with me for days. After that, similar situations kept happening. A question here. A coincidence there. Nothing serious on its own, yet each one reminded me how fragile my new life really was. A real identity grows naturally over decades. Mine had been assembled from records and guesswork. And no matter how convincing a lie becomes, reality always knows where the weak points are. The event that truly shook me happened on an ordinary Saturday afternoon. I was returning home with groceries when I noticed an older woman standing near my apartment building. At first, I paid little attention. Then she looked directly at me. Her expression changed instantly. She stared as if she'd seen a ghost. Before I could react, she walked toward me and quietly said, "William?" My heart nearly stopped. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Every scenario I'd prepared for involved paperwork, employers, or government offices. None involved someone who might have actually known the real William Carter. The woman introduced herself, and explained that she had once been a neighbor of his family many years ago. She talked warmly about people whose names I'd only seen in records. I nodded and forced myself to smile. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like hours. Afterward, I sat alone in my apartment replaying every word. Had I sounded convincing? Had she noticed anything strange? For the first time since adopting the identity, I genuinely believed my entire deception might collapse. The days after meeting that woman were some of the most stressful of my life. I became paranoid. Every phone call made me nervous. Every unexpected knock on my door sent a jolt of fear through my body. I kept imagining that she had realized something was wrong and was telling others about the strange encounter. At work, I struggled to focus. My mind constantly drifted back to our conversation, searching for mistakes. Had I answered too quickly? Too vaguely? Had I remembered the right names? The uncertainty was unbearable. Instead of stepping back, I made another mistake. I tried to gain more control over the situation. I started researching people connected to William's past, hoping to identify anyone else who might recognize inconsistencies. What I found only made me more anxious. There were still people out there who remembered him. Not many, but enough. Until then, I had treated the real William like a forgotten figure in an old file. Suddenly he felt real again, a person with relationships, memories, and history. And the more real he became, the more guilty I started to feel about wearing his name. By the second year, the biggest threat wasn't exposure. It was confusion. Living as William had become so routine that I sometimes responded to the name instinctively. Friends knew me as William. Coworkers knew me as William. My landlord, my neighbors, everyone around me used that name without question. The strange part was how comfortable it started to feel. That comfort terrified me. I would occasionally find old belongings from my previous life tucked away in boxes, photographs, documents, small reminders of who I had once been. Looking at them felt like looking at evidence from someone else's existence. I began avoiding those reminders. It was easier not to think about them. But the more I embraced my new identity, the stronger the guilt became. I wasn't merely lying to strangers anymore. I was erasing myself. Every day I spent as William pushed the person I used to be further into the background. Late at night, I would ask myself a question that had no good answer. If I abandoned my own identity completely, who exactly was I becoming? I never found a satisfying response. The beginning of the end arrived so quietly that I almost missed it. One morning, my supervisor asked me to stop by his office. His tone sounded normal, but something felt off. When I walked in, there was another man sitting across from the desk. He introduced himself as an investigator handling a routine records discrepancy. The word discrepancy hit me like a punch. I tried to remain calm. The investigator asked polite questions at first. Dates, addresses, employment history. Nothing aggressive. Nothing dramatic. Yet every answer felt like walking across thin ice. Years of preparation helped me stay composed, but I could feel sweat forming on my palms. The meeting ended without accusations. Still, I knew something had changed. For the first time, an official process was examining the identity I'd built. Maybe it was a simple administrative mistake. Maybe it was something more serious. I had no way of knowing. That uncertainty followed me home. I barely ate that evening. I sat in silence, staring at the wall, realizing that every lie I told over the years now depended on strangers deciding whether my story made sense. The call came 3 weeks later. I knew it was bad news the moment I heard the investigator's voice. He asked me to come in and answer a few additional questions. The request sounded polite, but there was a firmness behind it that hadn't been there before. By then, I already suspected the truth. Something had been uncovered. The interview lasted nearly 2 hours. They presented documents, timelines, and records that didn't fit together. Small inconsistencies that I had overlooked years earlier had finally connected into a larger picture. I tried to explain them away. At first, I blamed faulty records. Then poor memory. Then simple misunderstandings. The excuses sounded weak even to me. As the evidence accumulated, maintaining the lie became impossible. The room seemed to shrink around me. Every path I'd used to escape responsibility was suddenly blocked. Eventually, I stopped talking. There was no dramatic confession. No emotional outburst. Just silence. In that moment, I realized something painful. I hadn't been caught because of one mistake. I'd been caught because no fabricated identity can withstand endless scrutiny forever. Sooner or later, reality catches up. Once the deception unraveled, everything happened faster than I expected. People I had known for years suddenly looked at me differently. Some were angry. Others were confused. A few simply disappeared from my life without saying a word. I couldn't really blame them. Their trust had been built on a version of me that never truly existed. The hardest conversations weren't with investigators. They were with friends. I had shared meals with these people, celebrated birthdays, listened to their problems, and accepted their support. Now I had to watch them realize that the name they knew wasn't mine. The disappointment in their faces hurt more than any legal consequence. For years, I had justified my actions by telling myself that nobody was being harmed. I believed I was only escaping my past. But seeing those reactions forced me to acknowledge the damage I'd ignored. Trust is a fragile thing. Once broken, it rarely returns in the same form. For the first time since this began, I stopped searching for excuses. I stopped blaming circumstances. The choices had been mine, and so were the consequences. Years have passed since everything fell apart. People sometimes ask whether assuming another identity was worth it. The answer is simple: no. For a while, it felt like I had escaped. I found opportunities that seemed impossible before. I built relationships, earned trust, and experienced a version of life that I thought had been denied to me. But none of it was stable because it rested on a foundation of lies. The truth is that you never stop carrying the fear. Every unexpected question becomes a threat. Every official letter raises your pulse. Every stranger from the past feels like a possible disaster. Even when nobody is looking, you know the deception is there. That's not freedom. It's a different kind of prison. What I learned is that running from your mistakes doesn't erase them. It only postpones the moment you have to face them, and often makes that moment far worse. If anyone reading this is tempted to solve their problems by becoming someone else, don't. Whatever you're running from will eventually catch up. The hardest path, taking responsibility, is usually the only one that leads anywhere real. And that's a lesson I learned far too late.